This man is one of the worst serial killers in US history, and a lot of people don't know about him. This is the story of Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper. So Dean Corll was described as a shy, serious kid who was kind of a loner. His parents had remarried and divorced twice. His mother eventually got remarried and moved to the family to Texas. So I did mention that he goes by two different nicknames, and we are going to talk about both of them, but let's start with the first one, which is the Candyman. Now, he earned that nickname because when his family moved back to Texas, they opened up a candy company. Dean Corll eventually made his way to become the vice president of the candy company, and he earned a reputation of being really kind to the local children, particularly the teenage boys. Like, he put a pool table in the back of his factory so that the local kids could hang out. And he was known to give out lots of free candy. So they called Dean Corll the Candyman. He did make a couple of inappropriate advances to some of the younger staff at his company, but if they complained, he would just fire them. Then in 1967, Dean Corll met someone who is incredibly important to this story because they alter the course of each other's lives forever. In 1967, Dean Corll met David Owen Brooks, who was only 12 years old at the time. David was only in 6th grade when they met, and he was in a vulnerable position to be taken advantage of. His parents were divorced, he didn't have a lot of money, and he got made fun of all the time for the way he looked and because he wore glasses. But he started to hang out at the pool table behind Dean Corll's factory. Dean Corll gave him free candy. He gave him money if he needed it. And David said that Dean Corll was one of the first adults he had met who didn't make fun of the way he looked. And he came to view Dean Corll as a father figure in his life. He didn't know he made friends with a psychopath, though, because this is what Dean Corll was doing. Because Dean Corll exploited his trust and convinced him to let him essay him in exchange for money, which totally mind-fucked him because he eventually dropped out of high school and came to regard Dean Corll's apartment as his second home. And he unfortunately always felt a deep sense of loyalty to Dean Corll, which is so sad because he is one of those special kind of monsters that turns their victims into victimizers. So let's talk about Dean Corll's other nickname, which is the Pied Piper. If you don't know the story of the Pied Piper, it's about a town that has a rat infestation problem, so they hire a Pied Piper who uses a magic flute to spirit the rats away. But when the town refuses to pay the Pied Piper for his services, he uses his magic flute to lure away the town's children, and they're never to be seen again. It's a pretty dark story, but this is why Dean Corll earned the nickname of the Pied Piper. So between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll was known to have killed a minimum of 28 victims. All of his victims were male, and they were all between the ages of 13 and 20. And he would do that by turning David Brooks into an accomplice. Upon Dean Corll's instruction, David was told to lure acquaintances, even friends, to Dean Corll's apartment. He'd usually offer people like a ride or a party or something. Then once they were in his apartment, they were handcuffed and eventually strapped to this board, which was coined the torture board, because that's what it was. Once they were handcuffed here, Dean Corll's victims would be essayed, beaten, mutilated, tortured, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. And they'd meet their end due to strangulation or with a pistol. So this is where the story takes a big, sharp turn. For a long time, it was Dean and David would lure people to Dean's apartment. As chance would have it, David brought Elmer over to Dean's house one day as a potential victim. But Dean decided that he could use Elmer as part of his criminal enterprise, so David and Elmer started to lure people to Dean's apartment together. Dean Corll's crimes stopped in 1973, and it's crazy. Here's how. One day, business as usual, Elmer lured a male acquaintance over to Dean's house. But he also made the error of bringing over a girl he liked. Elmer figured she'd be safe because Dean wasn't attracted to girls. But Dean was furious, and Dean threatened to unalive both of his friends. And Elmer grabbed a gun, he yelled, "I can't have you kill my friends," and shot Dean Corll 6 times. And that's how Dean Corll was stopped. He passed away then and there. Elmer called the police right away, and he told them all about Dean Corll and what he had done and what they had done for him. And it turns out that Henley was more involved in some of the murders than David was. They were tried separately, but they were both sentenced to life sentences. David passed away from COVID in 2020. Elmer Henley is still in prison, and he is portrayed in the criminally underrated show Mindhunter if you want to learn more.